Welcome back to the Photaudiography podcast. I'm your host Luke, and today I'll be talking all about your editing workflow. Now, if you haven't listened to my previous podcast, please do so now, because I give a general overview of a post-production workflow for photographers, and I'm creating this episode to expand upon the editing portion of the overall post-production workflow, since it's such a large portion of it. First, let me give you an overview of the steps to follow with an editing workflow. As I mentioned in the previous episode, this can be adjusted or modified to fit your needs and your preferences, but it should hopefully give you a solid starting point. Typically, you'll want to edit in order of these steps: geometric corrections, dust and spot removal, tonal adjustments, color correction, specialized editing, and output. I will go into each step in greater detail and explain what each step is, why it's important, and why to do the steps in the order I have presented. Please note that I will not be talking about specifically what editing software to use. The next episode of the podcast, I plan on talking about the different editing software available and how that factors into the editing workflow. The first step in your editing workflow is to do geometric corrections. This type of editing includes cropping, straightening, and distortion correction. It is important to crop your image first, since you may be cropping out areas that will affect your histogram, which is important to keep an eye on while editing tone and color. I will have a future podcast episode that goes more in depth with the histogram, but for now, just keep in mind that cropping your image will affect the histogram. Another thing that works very closely with cropping is straightening your image. Straightening your image will help correct any lines in your photo to make sure they are straight and aesthetically pleasing. You may also want to consider correcting the perspective of your image. This type of correction is most often used when photographing architecture. For cropping, straightening, and perspective, using a non-destructive photo editor is most desirable, since it is easy to reverse and redo the cropping or straightening. Non-destructive photo editing is software that does not actually alter your photo, but instead includes a small file with instructions alongside the original image file of all the editing that it has done to the photo. Nothing is finalized until the photo is exported into a new image file. Another part of doing geometric corrections is distortion correction. Barrel and pincushion distortions happen when a lens distorts vertical or horizontal lines in your images. Some photo editing software has auto lens correction profiles that provides automatic barrel and pincushion distortion correction automatically based on what lens you were using. Speaking of lens corrections, now is a good time to do corrections for chromatic aberrations. Chromatic aberrations are colored fringes that appear on the edges of high contrast areas in your photo. These may look like purple or green or another color halo around the edges of things in your photo. Some software again provides automatic corrections based on if they have a correction profile in their database of correction profiles. The second step in the editing workflow process is to do dust and spot removal. If there is any dust on your image sensor or lens, it will show up on the image, so you will need to make sure that you are able to remove these spots to see if your image is usable or not. In addition to dust spots, there may be lens flare spots that you'll need to see if you can remove before going further with your editing. This step is also a good time to remove any red eye if present. If you're unable to correct the red eye in the photo, you may need to find a different image to use. The third step in photo editing is tonal adjustments. Tonal adjustments adjust the black and white values in your image or the contrast. Colors also have tones, which is why some color issues may get resolved when making tonal adjustments. Adjustments that will be made include exposure, contrast, highlights, shadows, whites, and blacks. This is where keeping an eye on the histogram is important. The main point is to make sure that the shadow areas in your image are bright enough and the highlight areas are recovered as best as possible, and the overall exposure and contrast for the image look how you desire. You can often adjust these using sliders, so feel free to play around and see how each affects your image. It is during this step that you'll want to plan on making your image grayscale or black and white. That adjustment should be made during this step. The fourth step in the editing workflow is color correction. Problems with color normally happen when white balance or exposure are off. When doing color correction on your photos, you may be able to adjust the red, green, and blue channels separately depending on what software you use. Sometimes the only color correction that you need to make is adjusting the white balance. If you are editing from a raw image, you will notice that you have much more freedom to adjust the white balance than if you are trying to adjust the white balance on a JPEG image. Another color adjustment you can make is a change in the saturation and vibrance. Saturation increases or decreases the depth of color in your image. You will want to increase this sparingly, especially when editing photos of people, because increasing the saturation can be harsh on skin tones. Some image editing software will allow you to increase the saturation of individual colors within an image, such as if you want to make the blue sky more vibrant without making other colors in the photo more saturated. The fifth step in our photo editing process is doing specialized editing of your photos. This specialized editing can include retouching, special effects, and noise reduction. Retouching can include smoothing skin and removing blemishes, or may include removing telephone wires or undesired objects from your photos. You will want to do the retouching after you do the tone and color correction, because retouching involves copying data from one area of an image to another. This is often called cloning. Many image editing software packages include a healing tool or a blemish removal tool that uses some kind of cloning to remove blemishes and unwanted objects in your image. Special effects and specialized editing can include making masks to provide specialized adjustments to one part of an image but not to another part of the image. Another specialized editing technique that is popular is to remove a background and change it to a different background. I'm not going to go into detail about all the different types of specialized editing, but at this point you can add any editing flares you would like. One of the hardest retouching and specialized editing techniques is noise reduction. Noise is grain or colored speckles that may appear in your image, especially when you have your camera set at higher ISOs. Noise reduction can result in a loss of saturation or will soften or smooth out fine details in your image. In certain circumstances, it's almost better to leave the noise in the photo than try to remove it. If you would like to learn more about noise, please check out the episode about ISO. In general, you want to try to keep your ISO as low as possible in the situation that you're in to avoid excess noise in your image, since the higher your ISO, the more noise or grain will appear in your image. The final step in the photo editing workflow process is output, which includes sizing and sharpening. When outputting your image, you first want to consider sizing. If you are printing, you want to make sure that the photo is cropped according to the size you would like to print. If your photo is cropped at a 3:2 ratio and you are wanting to print an 8:10, which is a 5:4 ratio, some of the image will be clipped during printing. It is important to keep in mind when doing the first step of the editing workflow, cropping, you'll need to keep in mind what your output will be. If you crop too closely to the subject in the photo and the crop ratio is different from the print ratio, your subject may get cut off during printing. Keep this in mind if you are giving a client digital copies of photos. If they go to print their images, you may want to give them several sizing options for the same image so they are not confused when portions of the photo are clipped because they were not sized to the proper print size. If you are posting your photos online, you may want to use a lower resolution, or the PPI, which is pixels per inch. I'm going to take a moment to explain what the difference between PPI and DPI is. PPI is pixels per inch, and that's the number of dots that appear on your computer screen. And DPI, which stands for dots per inch, refers to the dots of ink your printer creates on a printed photo. These are often used interchangeably, but I wanted to let you know the difference. I'm planning on having a whole episode explaining DPI and PPI, but for now I just wanted to let you know that they exist and a basic idea of what they are. The last step after resizing your image is to do any sharpening that may be needed. You want to do this after resizing your image to avoid accentuating noise or other artifacts in the photo. Also, doing tone adjustments with contrast can often make your image appear sharper. You want to make sure you don't over-sharpen your image, though. You may also want to choose to sharpen parts of your image rather than the whole image. There are many different considerations when outputting your images, but I like to export a JPEG version of the image and also a TIFF version of the file. I'd like to spend some more time talking about outputting your images and the different settings associated with that, but in general, export to the file format and file size that works best for your needs. Alright, well I think that's enough bad advice I have for you about editing workflows for now, so I'll see you later, Shutterbugs.